Hello there. Welcome to the third or fourth, depending on you count, I'll just say the final lecture on genetics. And as you can see, because you're here, I posted this as a YouTube video instead of a PowerPoint with inserted audio files. So I'm sort of experimenting with the two formats, and I hope you'll let me know pretty soon which you prefer. But I want to pick up on the topic that I raised in the last lecture of exactly why genotype does not always determine phenotype, exactly why it's the case that two people could have identical genes and have very different life outcomes, for example. So one explanation I already gave you is that some genes are recessive and they don't always show up in in a particular person, but they might show up in that person's offspring, for example. A very different answer to that question, which I think happens a lot, is the fact that environments matter. So environments also play a huge role in people's development and life outcomes. And we're going to explore in this lecture 4 or 5 specific examples of how that's the case. At least I hope we are. If I can get the screen to move, we are. I have this problem. So there we go. Let me delve into the details of this just a little bit here. We're going to get a little bit technical. Geneticists often focus on the so-called heritability. It's abbreviated H squared. If you've had a course in statistics, it's a very close cousin of R squared, which is the coefficient of determination. If you haven't, that's fine. You can completely forget about that. But essentially, a heritability score is a statistic that tells you, you hope, the degree to which a particular trait, whether it's height or skin tone or extroversion or liking for a certain color, has a genetic basis or not. So people have studied heritability on hundreds and hundreds of physical and psychological traits. And the way they typically do that, ideally do that, is to get a big group of identical twins, better yet, twins who were separated at birth, who grew up in different families. So that's the gold standard. You get a large group of maybe 1,000 identical twins who grew up apart. You might compare them with a group of 1,000 non-identical twins. Those are called fraternal twins or dizygotic twins. And you simply correlate one twin score on some trait that you care about and the twin's exact twin on that same trait. And if you see very high correlations, you draw the conclusion that that trait must be inherited because twins share all their genes, or virtually all of their genes. So if two people who share virtually all their genes but don't share their environment look very much alike, they have similar heights, they have similar IQ scores, they have similar levels of conscientiousness, for example, most geneticists draw the conclusion that that shows pretty clearly that that particular trait, whatever it is, it could be liking for chocolate, if that's what you care to measure. They would conclude that that particular trait is very highly heritable or very strongly inherited. So again, a concrete example that's been looked at many, many times is, and this is a fact, this is an empirical result, the correlation between IQ scores for identical twins who are separated at birth is much higher than the same correlation conducted for fraternal or non-identical twins who are also separated at birth. So that difference in correlations, huge correlation for identical twins, modest correlation for fraternal twins, that is taken as evidence that IQ must have a very big genetic component. There are lots of areas you could argue, ways you could argue about that, but the one that I'm going to tackle today, I'm just going to accept that IQ exists, even though my personal belief is that the idea of IQ is also inflated. We make IQ to be much more than it is, but if we just accept the idea of IQ and assume that it's real for sake of argument, we still don't know for sure, based on this finding, that IQ has a very large genetic component, and I hope to explain to you exactly why I believe that. So again, the logic of this research design, and it's pretty clever design, is that if people who share all their genes are very similar on a trait like IQ, then it must be genetic. Otherwise, why would they be so much like each other if it was not for their shared genes? But I'm going to make the point that twin studies have some big problems. And the biggest problem of all, I think, is the fact that identical twins don't just share their genes, their genotype, what's deep inside them. They also share a lot, and I mean a lot of physical features, from the shape of the eyeball to the shape of your nose and your lips and your height and your skin tone and your hair color, and of course your biological sex. Those things are virtually identical in identical twins. And for that reason, you can't really say, I would argue, that identical twins are separated at birth because they live in the same culture. You don't have a twin who grew up in Mexico and a twin who grew up in Mauritania or Sweden. Both twins, if they're separated at birth, grow up in America in American studies, and they both grow up in Denmark in studies done in Denmark. So they do grow up in the same culture. They almost always get adopted to middle class or wealthy families. Very, very poor families don't adopt people because they can barely feed the kids that they already have. Of course, again, they're the same biological sex, and that usually means the same gender. And most important of all, I think, they look a lot alike. So the question I'm going to tackle with you is whether the fact that identical twins look just alike inflates the estimate for the genetic basis of traits like IQ. Let's delve into that in a couple of concrete examples here. These are images of 4 actual twins, of course, that I found on the web. We see people from all ages and of all ages and from all walks of life. So if you look at these 2 little dudes here, they're both white, I'm assuming. In fact, they're probably Swedish or Norwegian, or they're towheads of a sort. They're both male, of course. They're both cute. And if they're both male and cute, any stereotypes you have about cute people, male people, white people, are going to apply to those kids. So when those kids get to 2nd grade someday, which I'm sure they've probably done by now, their teachers are going to assume that because they're boys and they're white, they're probably pretty good at math. And without knowing it, without meaning to, the teachers, even if they grew up separate from each other, which these 2 twins, of course, did not, because they're twins who grew up with the same parents, even if they grew up apart, they're going to be stereotyped in the same way. If you think these 2 guys are nerdy, are goofy looking, are country looking, then the teachers who had them in 4th grade and 8th grade and 9th grade and college, if they went to college, are going to think the same thing. If you think people who wear glasses are smart, they're both going to wear glasses. In fact, they could probably wear each other's glasses because they have exactly the same eyeball shape, and that's what determines mainly if you need glasses. If you think that, I think it's Rondo, I want to say Rondo and Tiki Barber, these former NFL football players who are identical twins, if you think they both tried out for a high school football team, one in Minnesota, one in Sarasota, Florida, you can be virtually guaranteed that because they're tall and muscular and African American, coaches are going to expect them to be good at football. It doesn't mean they're not good at football. Apparently they were, but those expectations on the part of coaches and teachers can affect their life outcomes. If you think girls aren't good at math, or you think Asians are good at math, or you have some belief in between those 2 extremes, the 2 cute Asian girls you see here are both going to either benefit from or be harmed by those particular stereotypes about Asians or about girls. So because identical twins look just alike, same skin tone, same lip shape, same hair color, same height, same basic body build, people their entire lives are going to treat them very much the same, not because they have a gene for extroversion or a gene for high IQ, but perhaps because of the stereotypes that we have about people. So that's a subtle but I think important point, that it's very hard to know if studies of twins separated at birth really do document that some of the traits like IQ, for example, that we think have a big genetic component, if it's really that big. I can't say exactly how much we should adjust those coefficients, but in my opinion, lots and lots of research in social psychology shows that those tests are going to tend to overestimate the degree to which genetics determines something like IQ or athleticism. Okay, So that's one example, I think, of how environments shape behavior. In fact, in the example I just gave you, environments could look like their genes because of the way that we stereotype people. Here are four other examples of how environments can powerfully shape human development that take a very different approach than the one I just described. And I hope these other examples are much more straightforward than the subtle example I just gave you about stereotyping. Okay, the first new example is the example I like to call the Prince and the Pauper. And I'm going to briefly pause the video so that I can pull up this audio story from NPR. All right, we're back, and you'll be happy to learn. I hope that you got to skip the commercial. I was able to get the window to open, and I got it to the beginning of the story. And so you're going to hear a 4-minute audio story from an NPR, that's National Public Radio, a very reliable source for news, about a Japanese prince, so to speak, who was switched at birth with a Japanese pauper, a rich kid and a poor kid who were accidentally switched at birth.
Now the story of two children switched at birth. In Tokyo, a court has ordered a hospital to pay damages to a 60-year-old man who recently discovered that he was sent home from the hospital with the wrong parents. The man's biological family was wealthy. The family that took him home was poor. The judge in the case found that the hospital mix-up deprived the man of an opportunity to gain a higher education and has ordered the operator of the hospital to pay some $300,000. For more on the story, we've called Lucy Kraft in Tokyo. Take us back 60 years ago. What happened when this man went home from the hospital with the wrong parents? Where did his life go from there?
Yeah, it's really the tale of a prince and a pauper. There were two babies born within a few minutes of each other. Both of them end up going home with the wrong mother. And in one family, the father dies fairly young. Single mother struggles to raise three boys on welfare. They're stuck in a tiny apartment. It's only 100 square feet. Meanwhile, the other boy grows up in a big house, a garden with a pond, tutors, private university. He grows up and becomes the president of a real estate company. And boy number one starts working at a factory after junior high school to support his family. And life kind of goes downhill from there.
And the man who was raised poor and became a truck driver, who has asked to remain anonymous, gave a news conference this week. Tell us a little bit about what he said.
It was a very emotional news conference. He was telling this harrowing story. He says, March 30th, 1953, my birthday. I want to turn the clock back to that time. When I learned about my real parents 2 years ago, I thought, oh, how I wish they had raised me. It's just impossible to understand what this person was going through. And that's part of the reason people have expressed so much sympathy for him. He's shown so much grace and humility considering this horrendous experience he's going through.
Did he say anything about how he feels towards the family that raised him?
Yes, he says he feels grateful to both the family that raised him and to his birth parents. And he also says he feels no enmity or resentment or bitterness towards the boy who switched places with him. He said, we're both victims in this, so I can't be angry at him.
Do we know how the mix-up happened?
We don't know the details, and unfortunately the people who perpetrated this tragedy are long gone from the scene. But NHK, the state broadcasting network, dug up some records from something called the Japanese Society of Legal Medicine, and they found that between 1957 and 1971, this is shortly after this person's case occurred, 32 cases of switched babies were recorded. So it's something that happened with awful regularity, apparently.
And how did the story of this switch come out more than half a century later?
In 2009, after the rich parents died, four surviving brothers, I should say, the three younger ones became suspicious of the eldest brother. He didn't resemble them in any way. And so they decided to check him out. And they did DNA sampling, and they found that the DNA didn't match. They went back to the hospital. They checked the records. They tracked down the other brother and got his DNA sample. And then their suspicions were confirmed.
You know, in the United States, despite talk of income inequality, we have this ethos that anyone can grow up to become anything despite the circumstances of their birth and their childhood. Does the same exist in Japan?
A lot of bloggers have posted about this. They've pointed out that this boy did show a lot more initiative than the family he was raised with. While everyone else stopped their schooling at junior high, he went on to pay for and put himself through vocational school, but he ended up, in the end, just being a truck driver. And a lot of people have said this is proof positive that it doesn't matter what your background is, nature cannot overcome nurture, and people who are born into poverty are doomed to stay there. This isn't completely true. One of the richest men in Japan, Masayoshi Son, also comes from very humble beginnings, but certainly for the majority of people in Japan, this is certainly the case.
Reporter Lucy Kraft in Tokyo. Thanks so much, Lucy.
My pleasure.
I'm going to take another quick
And
break,
now,
and I'll get
more
back
from
to
NPR.
I'll get back to the lecture, other part. All right, we're back, and I had to resist the temptation to keep listening to NPR to hear the story about the Postmaster General, but I did it. We're back, and I hope you heard that really touching, chilling, sad, weird story of two babies who were switched at birth, and the fact that the babies were, their environments were switched, and it was the kid who had the good environment who had much superior economic outcomes, better education, much better income, raises big questions about whether genes can overcome the environment. Now, just to be clear, I don't take the position that genes do not matter at all, but I take the position that environment probably matters a lot more than most people think it does. And certainly you can have all the great genes on Earth, and if you're born in a difficult environment, there's certain things you aren't going to be able to do. So, for example, no matter how talented you were in the US in the 1930s, if you were black, you were not going to play professional baseball because the Jim Crow laws and segregation were so powerful that there was just absolutely nothing you could do. So, of course, there are times that genes do matter, but even in today's world, where sources of things like discrimination are more subtle and not so easy to detect, although they're still there, environments can have a very powerful impact on people's lives. It's certainly not the case that genes are destiny. All right, moving ahead here, trying to moving ahead and coming back to the topic of sports. You know, I say I don't like sports a lot, but I sure do come across a lot of examples examples involving sports. The example I'd like to share with you here, the second additional example of the power of environments, I call it the Januarians and the Decembrians, which is a wacky way of saying this. If you look at Canadian National Hockey League players, these are professional hockey players drafted between 1980 and 2006. Notice the study came out in 2013 using data from a period about 20 years prior to that. And the data cover 16 or 17 seasons. You see here that boys born in the months of January, February, or March were more than twice as likely, about 2.5 times as likely to play in the NHL as were boys born in October, November, or December. So this paper was published in a very influential journal called PLOS One, and it was published because it showed something that should not be the case. We don't believe in horoscopes. It's not better. You're not a better person or a more athletic person if you're born in the first 3 months of the year than if you're born in the last 3 months of the year. And yet we see people making it to the NHL at more than twice the rate of their fellow hockey players who are born later in the year. So what the heck is going on here? And what does it have to do with the power of environments? The answer is pretty straightforward, actually. If you look at how hockey works in Canada, in the junior leagues, you see a pretty straightforward system where they put boys in on elite hockey teams based on their age group. And of course, we have age groups in America as well, in the United States as well. But in Canada in particular, a boy who turns 10 in January would be in the 10-year-old age group that year. And a boy who turns 10 in December of that same year is also in the 10-year age group. So stop for just a moment and think about that. One boy was born, let's make it extreme, January 3rd, the third day of the year in a given year. Another boy was born December, let's say late December that same year. So the boy born in January is almost a year older than the boy born in December. That means he's a year taller, a year faster, a year smarter, a year more exposed to anything that might help him become a better hockey player. And so the idea here is pretty simple. Coaches mistake biological maturity for giftedness. And once a coach snags you, because when you were 10.8 and the other boys were 10.2 and you were a little bit better than them, this leads to a positive cycle that gets you more opportunities, more coaching, more travel teams, and so forth, and ultimately leads to this massive advantage for boys born at the first part of the year compared with boys born in the later part of the year. If you know anything about racehorses, you know that a similar thing happens there. In a given year, they race what they will call, let's say, 3-year-olds. Well, some 3-year-olds were born earlier than others, and those 3-year-old horses are several months older, stronger, faster, and they're more likely to win big races. So in this case, a haphazard environmental effect, a random effect, did you happen to be born in, let's say, February or November, has a big impact, of course, completely independent of genes on your athletic success. Okay? I hope you can guess that school teachers do the same thing. And if a kid is on the older end of kids in his or her class, a little bit taller, a little bit more emotionally mature, and arguably a little bit brighter, teachers might mistake those traits for genius and give that kid, without knowing they're doing it, a leg up on other kids. So those are examples of arbitrary environmental factors that have a big impact on kids' intellectual, physical, athletic development. All right, example number 3, or additional example number 3, I call this the poor and the not quite so poor Cherokees. This is a study of Native American Indians in North Carolina. The paper I'll mention here came out in 2003, so almost a couple of decades ago now. Costello and colleagues were doing a study of poverty and mental illness in North Carolina. These were psychiatrists and psychologists who studied clinical disorders, and they did extensive clinical interviews to measure mental illness repeatedly in a group of kids between 1993 and 2000. So they had planned to do that study for a long time. I'm sure they got a big grant to do it. They were doing the study when something interesting happened, and they took advantage of it. So their study included 3 groups of kids. They had a group of Cherokee Indians, which is a tribe native to North Carolina, and they also had local white kids and local black kids. We'll focus mostly on the Indians because you'll see here that something very interesting happened to them that did not happen to the white kids or the black kids. So let's look at that. In 1996, about halfway through this 7-year study, the Indians got a lot of money. Well, a lot of money relative to their poverty level. They got a casino. And the tribal leaders, I think pretty wisely, decided that every Indian in that tribe, regardless of whether the leaders liked them, regardless of their level of attractiveness, regardless of their criminal record, everyone who's a member of the tribe, no matter who they were or what they did, notice, no matter what their genes were like, got this windfall. And by 2001, it went up bit by bit by bit. By 2001, that meant an extra $500 a month. That's $6,000 a year, an additional $500 a month increase in monthly income, 6,000 in annual income to every Cherokee Indian child studied. So the white kids didn't get the money, the black kids didn't get the money because they're not a part of the tribe. And you can think of that as a natural manipulation, a natural experiment to see what happens if all of a sudden a group of people who as a group are pretty darn poor get to be not so poor. They don't become wealthy, but they become less poor than they used to be. And the nice thing about that study, again, is we had known for decades, of course, that poor kids do worse than rich kids on all kinds of outcomes, from math grades to IQ tests to conduct problems. But this study was different than all those correlational studies because it had a natural manipulation, and it meant that you could look at a group of kids, a big group, a tribe of kids who got a windfall at random regardless of their genetic makeup. You could always argue based on previous studies that, well, maybe some kids are poor, their parents are poor because they have bad genes. I'm sorry. But if you take that heavily genetic perspective, you could always argue that some people have bad things happen to them basically because they deserve it. They have bad genes, and people with bad genes get bad outcomes. This study overcomes that critique by having a random outcome, a random manipulation. The money that we're going to see in just a minute here really changed the lives of a lot of these kids. Let's dig into the details of the study just a little bit here. This is the percentage of families living below the poverty line, both before and after the casino windfall in 1996. So if you take the black and white kids and average them together, you can see that a little bit more than 20% of kids, the black and white kids, were poor. So if you look over here, I think you can see my pointer. It's about 25% there. Here it's about 20% even. So if we average those, something like 22% of the black and white kids averaged together. My guess is the black kids were poorer than the white kids, but maybe not in that neighborhood. But the non-Indian families had a poverty rate of about 22, let's call that 22%. If you look at the American Indian families, their poverty rates 1993, 94, 95, still in 1996 were at or above 50%. 1997, still about 50%. 1998, it starts to go down. And by the year 2000, it had dropped to something like 24%. So you see that eventually, after this economic windfall, the rates of poverty went way down in the American Indian families. And that meant that this group of researchers could identify Indians who were the benefit of that windfall and look at their life outcomes as they were happening in school, for example. And that's what these data show you. So we have three groups of kids here. We have kids who were so poor to begin with prior to the casino that they were still poor. They were still below the poverty line even after that big windfall. And you will notice, oh, by the way, higher scores here are worse. These are kids who get into trouble more. They're diagnosed more often with conduct disorder, oppositional defiant, basically what most teachers call a bad kid. This kid's a troublemaker is what most teachers would say. A clinical psychologist would be more careful and say, this kid might have a conduct disorder. This kid has issues with authority. This kid, yes, gets in trouble a lot. So for the kids who stayed poor, they got in a lot of trouble before the casino. They got in just as much trouble, maybe even a little bit more after the casino. So if kids' families got money, but they were still dirt poor even after the money, they did not show one bit of improvement. At the other extreme, let's look at the kids who are already okay. Prior to the casino, these kids were Native American Indians living in the tribe, but they weren't poor. They were living above the poverty line. Hope you can see here that their rates of conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder were pretty low, 1.3, and they were still pretty low, about 1.3 or 1.4 after, no change whatsoever. So kids were already okay. They were already okay financially. Their families were making enough money to get by. Getting a bit more money didn't benefit them. But there was one group of kids, the kids who were sort of on the cusp of poverty, who benefited enormously from this manipulation, this windfall, and that was the kids who had been poor prior to the windfall, but were no longer poor after the windfall. And you can see it that in this group of kids, they were doing quite badly initially. They were getting in trouble about as much as the persistently poor kids. But once they got this money that lifted their families out of poverty, and they no longer met the technical definition of poverty, they became virtually identical to the kids who had never been poor, with very low rates of conduct disorder, very low rates of oppositional defiant disorder, and other negative outcomes as well. So in essence, the kids who stayed poor didn't benefit. The kids who were lifted out of poverty benefited enormously in major things like, does this kid get expelled from school? And the kids who were never poor to begin with were already doing okay. And of course, they kept doing okay after this natural manipulation. That's another example of the effects of poverty on outcomes, completely independent of any genetic predisposition to be aggressive, to get in trouble, to not mind the teacher, and so forth. So that's a dramatic example of the power of the environment to shape a kid's outcome. And I'm happy to say that just a couple of years ago, this group of researchers published a couple of follow-up papers. I just had a chance to read them this summer that follow those kids 6, 8, 10 years later. And they show that all kinds of important life outcomes, from teenage pregnancy rates to alcohol and drug abuse problems to petty arrest rates, on all those major indicators and a few others I didn't bother to mention, the kids who are lifted from poverty by the casino money did much better than you'd expect them to in the wake of that natural manipulation. So if families living below the poverty line are brought above the poverty line, the life outcomes for those kids are much, much better. That's an example of the power, not of genes, but of the environment. All right, one more quick example. I'm going to zip through this quickly because, these are animals, not people, at least some of them are. But one of my favorite theories in evolutionary psychology, I think it came up already in week 1 in the course, is called life history theory. And it says animals, people included, because we are animals with identical genes often develop very differently in different environments. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of that. An example I probably did not give you yet is water fleas. In fact, one of my good friends at the University of Buffalo does extensive research on water fleas. These are little creatures that you can barely see with the naked eye that live in ponds, for example. And if a water flea grows up in a pond environment where there aren't many predators, it looks like the one you see on the left here. If you take an identical water flea, same exact genes, and you let it grow up in an environment where there are lots of predators, and the water flea's body can detect that chemically, it grows these elaborate horns and prickly defenses, and a much tougher case that it does not develop in that other environment. In fact, when people first observed these many decades ago, they thought they were 2 different species of water flea. They're not. They're genetically identical, but the exact environment that they grow up in has a big impact on the exact developmental route, the phenotypic route that they take as they mature in the short life cycle of a water flea. Now, we're not water fleas. We're also not clownfish. But if you want a really dramatic example of environments from the animal kingdom, clownfish like Nemo from the movie Finding Nemo, every clownfish that ever hatches is hatched as a male. There aren't any female clownfish hatchlings. They live in groups. They fight. They compete for resources. Some of them, of course, get eaten by predators. But in a given group of clownfish, the one that becomes the largest becomes female in adulthood. So if the female dies, gets fished away, or a little barracuda eats it, the largest female fish in that group becomes physically male, even though she was born physically female, even though she was born genetically male. So clownfish are known as true hermaphrodites because they can change their sex in adulthood. That's a dramatic effect of the effects of the environment, not genes, on development. And that kind of thing is not as unusual as you would think in the animal world. Getting back to the world of people, I'm pretty sure this came up last week, but I'll say it again in case I'm misremembering. The degree to which you sweat, I'm pretty sure this came up when we talked about critical and sensitive periods. The degree to which a person sweats, exactly how many sweat glands you have, is based on your first 2 or 3 years of life. And as I probably mentioned to you, because I grew up in rural Georgia, where it's pretty hot, hotter than Maryland certainly, not quite as hot as the Philippines, for example, but because I grew up in Georgia with no air conditioning, between the ages of 0 and about 12, by the way. We finally got air conditioning when I was, I think, probably 15. So I think I was a freshman in high school. We finally got air conditioning. I grew up without air conditioning, so that means I sweat a lot because for the first couple or 3 years of life, your body takes account of exactly how hot and humid it is where you live, and that programs you to have a very different number of sweat glands if you grow up in Georgia or Puerto Rico or sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia than if you grow up in Norway or Canada or even Maryland. So the degree to which you sweat a lot is determined very not by your genes, but very heavily by your physical environment. So that's a wacky list of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how you count, very different examples. But the point that ties them all together, I hope you'll agree, is that genetics are not the whole story. In fact, it's very easy to become convinced that certain things are genetic that in fact have a lot to do with your life history, a lot to do with your environment, and not so much to do with your genes. So again, I don't want to say that genes aren't real. Of course they are. Of course they matter. We know, for example, that physical height has a big genetic component. Skin tone has a big genetic component. Some personality traits might have a big genetic component, but in a lot of cases of people, I think we tend to overestimate the contribution of genetics to things like IQ. I think that gets us where we want to be. And I hope the conclusion you'll draw from this set of lectures is sometimes it is the case that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, but in other cases, the apple can fall very, very far away from the tree. Genes are not destiny, environments matter a lot, and that means that we need to do as a culture, as teachers, as parents, everything we can to give every kid a fair chance to develop and learn and become a healthy, happy adult. Thanks. Talk to you soon.